Yeah, well, Pakistan has had a mix of policies about how to deal with its militants on the western border. In 2003, 2004, it was basically a military approach, which wasn't very successful. The Pakistani army took fairly heavy casualties, and it wasn't popular politically in Pakistan. So then they moved to a period of peace agreements. 2005, 2006, those peace agreements weren't particularly successful either because it allowed the militants on the western border between Pakistan and Afghanistan to regroup. And today it's a sort of mix of peace agreements, some military action, some efforts at reconstruction. And of course, there really is no good answer. The Musharraf government has cracked down on some of its militants. I mean, it's cracked down on Al-Qaeda leaders who are living in Pakistani cities. Occasionally it's done some military operations against the Pakistani Taliban, but as a general proposition, it's been a mix of some military operations, some peace agreements and ceasefires, some efforts of reconstruction in the area where the militants live, with nothing's really worked. I mean, clearly, the violence has gone up in 2008 in Afghanistan as a result of people crossing the border from Pakistan. And of course, the violence in Pakistan's gone up. I mean, there were more suicide attacks in 2007 than in a year in Pakistani history. So it's not an easy problem really to deal with. Pakistani military doesn't really have a counterinsurgency strategy. They're built for a land war with India. They don't have counterinsurgency doctrine that I'm aware of, counterinsurgency capability. When they do go in, these military actions are more like punitive expeditions rather than attempting to go in to clear territory, hold territory, and build things, which is what you would do in a classic counterinsurgency strategy. So right now, they're not doing it. Well, I think the new administration, 2009, there's going to be a new American administration. There's already a relatively new Pakistani administration. There's also a new head of CENTCOM, General Petraeus, who's going to be in charge of military operations in Afghanistan and also military policy to Pakistan. So a lot of things have changed at the same time, and in a way that's a good thing because the situation in Afghanistan has gone from okay to pretty bad. The situation in Pakistan is also not good. The militants on both sides of the border are operating fairly freely. There are more suicide attacks in Afghanistan and in Pakistan in the last year or so than there have been at any time in history, and more American soldiers are dying in Afghanistan than in Iraq. And clearly there is a problem, but there's also an opportunity because there's a new Pakistani administration, there's a new American administration, there's also a new military leadership at CENTCOM, which is the US military command in charge of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is General Petraeus, who just came from Iraq. So I think that, there's a possibility that there will be a major strategic rethink about what we should be doing in Afghanistan. The problem is the United States has quite a lot of leverage in Afghanistan because it's got 30,000 or so troops, and it's also providing a fair amount of aid. The United States' leverage on Pakistan is really pretty small, particularly since Pakistanis, generally speaking, are quite anti-American and don't want American soldiers on their territory. I was in Pakistan the day after Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, and I was surprised that that didn't provide some sort of re-evaluation amongst the Pakistani establishment about the way that the militants have been dealt with. After all, she was the country's most popular politician, and if she was alive today, she'd be running the party that runs the country. And she was killed by Pakistani Taliban. But still, Pakistani establishment, Pakistani military doesn't seem to have geared up to really deal with the problem. The problem isn't easy to deal with because it's not just a military problem, it's a domestic problem. So you can't just go in and kill people. You've got to have a counterinsurgency strategy where you protect the population, you separate out the irreconcilables, you provide reconstruction aid in the areas that these militants are operating in. So, and as we've seen in Iraq, that is not an easy thing to fix simultaneously. However, you can do it. I mean, it can be done. The Pakistani military and the Pakistani establishment could sort of say, well, the time has really come to deal with this problem through a mixture of military operations conducted in the right way with a counterinsurgency strategy and efforts to build up these areas from a point of view of education, jobs, etc. But even if the Pakistani military and the Pakistani establishment got together and said we're going to really have a unified policy, it would take years to sort this thing out. I think there's a huge amount of suspicion between the Afghans and the Pakistanis. I mean, you've got Afghan and American officials saying that elements of the Pakistani intelligence service were involved in the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul in July of 2008 that killed 50 people. Well, that's an act of war by elements of the Pakistani military against both the Indian government and the Afghan government, in a sense. So, I think there's a great deal of suspicion between the Afghans and the Pakistanis, and so that's been around for a long time, and the United States can't solve Afghan-Pakistani suspicions of each other, but what the United States can do is say, look, we're going to be in Afghanistan for a very long time, which I think we will be. And we should say so publicly, because if it's clear that the United States isn't going to pull out a year or two from now or 3 years from now, the Pakistani military is going to be less inclined to keep these militants, tolerate the presence of militants on their territory. Because the reason the Pakistani establishment, or Pakistani military to some degree, tolerates the Pakistani Taliban's presence on its territory is they're not convinced that the United States is going to be in Afghanistan forever, and they think that having the Pakistani Taliban as a sort of insurance policy for the day the United States withdraws. The Pakistani intelligence apparatus is part of the Pakistani military, and the Pakistani military is, like all militaries, they take orders from the top. So I'm not convinced that the Pakistani military intelligence apparatus is penetrated by Al-Qaeda, nor do I think it's necessarily deeply embedded with the Taliban, but it does seem to be that rogue elements or people who've retired from the Pakistani military intelligence agency may be advising or helping out, or the Pakistani Taliban. And it certainly seems that the Pakistani military has proven unwilling or incapable of going after the Taliban on its territory. It's never really clear, is that a lack of willingness, or is it a lack of capability, is it both? In the last few years, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, who were quite different. I mean, Al-Qaeda is a foreign-led Arab organization. Pashtuns dominate the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But increasingly, the Taliban's taken its ideological cues and tactical cues from Al-Qaeda. Ideologically, the Taliban now see themselves as part of the global jihad. They're talking about Iraq, they're talking about Palestine. They never talked about these things before. They also say that they're taking direction from Al-Qaeda, and they also obviously have learned suicide attacks and ID attacks from looking at Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or learning from Al-Qaeda in Iraq directly. So I think that they're much closer together than Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were much closer together today than they might have been 3 or 4 years ago. It's very hard to find one person if they're trying to evade being captured. I mean, people stay on the FBI's most wanted list in the United States for years. So imagine the problem along the Afghan-Pakistan border. Bin Laden is almost certainly there, but it's not. If somebody isn't going to basically pick up a cash reward by dropping a dime on you, or if you're not talking on satellite or cell phones, and it's hard to find people. So I'm certain that Bin Laden is on the Afghan-Pakistan border, more likely in Pakistan than Afghanistan. But given the fact that the Afghan-Pakistan border is 1,500 miles long, which is the distance between Washington, D.C. and Denver, that's a pretty long border. And obviously, I think that Bin Laden's probably on the north side of that Afghan-Pakistan border, but still, it's inaccessible territory. The people are hostile to outsiders. Bin Laden isn't making any obvious mistakes, and people can stay on the run for years. I mean, you look at Eric Rudolph, who bombed the Centennial Park in Atlanta during the Olympics. He spent 5 years on the run, turned up, a few miles from where he was born. 5 years later, he was captured. So it's hard to find one person. So I think that, I'm sure Bin Laden is on the Afghan-Pakistan border, probably on the Pakistan side, probably on the north part of that border. But that's an informed hypothesis. That's not real information. Well, I think one of the big problems right now in Afghanistan is that the United States, NATO, and the Afghan army are killing a fair number of Afghan civilians, particularly U.S. airstrikes. I mean, because the United States has decided that Afghanistan was going to be an economy of force operation, which means that there aren't that many American boots on the ground, that means that you call in a lot more air power. And there are a lot more airstrikes in Afghanistan than there are in Iraq. And airstrikes are a blunt instrument. You're bound to kill more civilians with an airstrike than you are if you're doing ground operations. So in 2007, there were more Afghan civilians killed by coalition activity than by Taliban activity. So that's a big deal. Now in 2008, it's got a little bit better, but we're still seeing too many Afghan civilian casualties caused by American airstrikes, and it's a very sensitive issue in Afghanistan. President Karzai's repeatedly kind of made it an issue, and Afghans themselves are quite angry about it. And obviously, if we're trying to persuade the Afghan population that we're working in their interests, killing hundreds of them in American airstrikes isn't going to help. We can demand other European countries in NATO to send in more troops till we're blue in the face. It is not going to happen. It's not going to happen because most NATO countries don't really want to engage in war fighting. They see this as a peacekeeping operation, and they're happy to send peacekeepers, but not soldiers who are going to engage in war fighting. So I think the NATO operation in Afghanistan is pretty close to a strategic failure. And I think there's a wide recognition of that. The United States is probably going to take over responsibility for more and more of the more troublesome areas in the south and the east over the next 2 years. And NATO countries will probably just be in the north and the west, the areas of Afghanistan that are basically not succumbing to violence. Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have said that they'll send thousands more troops to Afghanistan. And that's a good thing, because right now, the Iraqi security services, soldiers and police, are 3 times larger than the Afghan security services. And Afghanistan is, in fact, a country which is 30% larger, has a larger population, and topographically is much harder place to control. It's mountains as opposed to deserts. So Afghanistan has a huge security shortfall, definitely needs more soldiers, more police. So sending more American soldiers is a good thing. However, they have to be the right kind of soldiers. It doesn't really matter if you send reservists on their first tour to Afghanistan. That's not going to help. What you really need are special forces who can train up Afghan soldiers, Afghan police, civilian advisors, because basically you've got to make the Afghan police and the Afghan army much bigger and much more efficient. Otherwise, you're not going to have security. And without security, you can't have reconstruction.